Hi, I hope you're well and have had a lovely Easter. I wanted to share with you something of what we're going to be looking at on Sundays over the next few weeks. It's something I've been mulling over for quite a while, but never quite got round to doing with you. And then, as we were approaching the end of the Roman series, and I was speaking with Pauline about what she planned to share with you on the Sunday after Easter, it felt a good time to roll this out. And it's a series based on some words Jesus says to a number of his disciples as he calls them in the Gospels. Come, follow me. So this week, over a few short videos in the build-up to starting this series, I want to introduce something of what we're going to be looking at. It's partly so that on Sundays I'm not spending a lot of time doing background and I can just focus on what we want to share on Sundays, but also I hope you will find it helpful as we come to look at what we're sharing. I think that we are culturally in quite an interesting moment. Over the last year or so, some of you might have heard about a report called The Quiet Revival. And this was a report from the Bible Society. It was based on some research by YouGov, which suggested a surge in interest in Christianity and church attendance, particularly amongst the young. And even if you hadn't heard about the original research, you might have noticed in the news more recently that YouGov later reported that there was a flaw in their data, which led to the Bible Society withdrawing the report. And that's not to say there was nothing of value in there or that it was completely false. Other independent surveys have reported an increase in baptisms, confirmations, numbers enrolling for courses like Alpha. Annual sales of Bibles have reportedly more than doubled since 2019 and went up by more than a quarter, so 25 to 28% in between 24 and 25 alone. Enough to say, really, that there is something interesting going on in this cultural moment. At the same time, I've noticed a shift in the way Christianity is discussed or perceived in wider society or media. Sportsmen like Mark Gahey or Eberechi Eze or Maro Itoje have been really quite open in talking about their faith in ways that I've not really noticed much in British sport before. It's been kind of quite an American thing, but much more so in Britain now. And there's also been a notable increase in appeals to something called our Judeo-Christian culture. At one level, that's in people like the writer Tom Holland talking about how so much that we take for granted in our supposedly secular, Western, godless world was in fact shaped by Christianity. In a sentence I never thought I would ever say, Richard Dawkins, author of The God Delusion and once described as one of the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse, has more recently taken to describing himself as a cultural Christian, saying, I like to live in a culturally Christian country, even if I don't believe a single word of Christian faith. He described this being similar to friends who would call themselves cultural Jews or cultural Muslims. Now, to be fair to Dawkins, he has actually been saying something quite similar for nigh on 20 years. But I have noticed this idea of the cultural Christian popping up amongst people who don't want to necessarily say they've got any faith, but also want to kind of lay hold to some of the good that Christianity has brought to our society. That said, there are other circumstances in which I find the supposed Judeo-Christian heritage that is being pointed to remotely resembling anything of Jesus of Nazareth. But it does at least open the door to questions like, what really is a Christian? What does it look like? What should it look like? Because I'm reminded of an interview a number of years ago, which I read, with a bookseller who was asked about what were the most popular types of books that were non-fiction. And he, not surprisingly, pointed to the fact that probably the biggest sellers were How to Get Rich Quick. Who doesn't want to do that? But after that, he came to books on spirituality, and he said books on Buddhism are particularly popular. And when asked why that was, he said, why Buddhism, say, as opposed to Christianity, he said, well, Christianity is often presented as a system of belief, whereas Buddhism presents itself as a way of life. And I find that interesting. It is true that sometimes Christianity can, often be presented in that way. A Christian can be seen as someone who believes certain things, maybe prayed a certain prayer at some point, grew up in a society that was largely shaped by Christian values, was baptized as a baby. And they can maybe find Christianity preferable to alternatives. But it doesn't necessarily involve anything about a relationship with Jesus, let alone actually obeying him or following him. But what's actually quite interesting is that the first name of the Christian community was the Way, or as in a way of life. In the Bible, you will only find the word Christian 3 times, and actually it's never a good thing. It was described as an insult. It was only in time that they came to own that insult as it meant little Christ, and they thought, well, what's wrong with that? The far more common way of describing in the Bible those associated with Jesus is disciple. In comparison with the 3 mentions of Christian, there are over 260 references to disciple in the New Testament. Jesus didn't come to make us Christians. He came to make us disciples. The writer Dallas Willard once commented, the greatest issue facing the world today, with all its heartbreaking needs, is whether those who by profession or culture are identified as Christian will become disciples, students, apprentices, practitioners of Jesus Christ. Think of that. The greatest issue facing the world? What does that mean? What does it look like? Well, that's what we're going to be thinking about over the next few weeks. And I'm going to unpack a little more of the sort of background of this in the next video, which, God willing, will drop tomorrow.